my name is Ioanna Filippidi, and I'm just finishing my PhD at the University of Sheffield. And I'm here to tell you a story about David Bowie, onions, and matching socks. So the other day I was cooking, and as I was chopping my onions, I realized that I was humming and swaying along to a tune playing in my head. Now, after searching in my memory for a bit, I realized that it was one of my all-time favorites, David Bowie, Life on Mars. I mean, you've had this experience before, right? I say smiling and nodding faces, so it's safe to guess that you have indeed. But indeed, I don't have to guess. I know so from previous research that mostly everybody has it, because out of 12,000 people that a guy from Finland investigated, nearly 90% said that they've had it at least once a week. Now, many use the name earworms as to describe the experience, from German Ohrwurm. And its scientific name is not Latin, as often is the case for worms and other insects, but involuntary musical imagery, as we lovingly call it in the scientific community. You see, I'm a music psychologist, and the field that investigates musical experience and behaviors. And I've studied this particular phenomenon for the past 5 years. You see, my theory is that the ways that we listen to music condition ourselves to associate music with those activities, and this is why we have music in our head. I'm going to explain a bit more about this, but first let's take a history/science break. It is the beginning of 20th century, and this, in all intentions, animal-loving guy, Ivan Pavlov, conducts an experiment where whenever he was feeding his dogs, he would ring a bell. And after countless repetitions of presenting his dogs with food, he noticed, by ringing the bell, he noticed that the dogs would start salivating just by hearing the bell without any food, because they had associated the information that is food, I'm eating now, with the bell. And this process is called classical conditioning. Now, if we take a moment to think about our everyday life music experiences, we'll see from the literature and our own experiences that what we often do is we tend to associate music with activities. We tend to listen to music while we're running or while we're cooking. And we also tend to combine music with our behaviors. So we listen to music when we're sad. We listen to music where we're bored. Or we simply listen to music because we want to listen to music, because it makes us feel good, or at least better. Now, another thing with music is that we have very specific musical taste. We have that genres that follow us throughout our lives. I mean, I know I went through a phase of heavy metal in my teens, and one that my parents were very glad when it was over. But we tend to repeat that music over and over again, and we tend to have those life soundtracks of that song that reminds us of that road trip, or that girlfriend, or our grandparents. And we really tend to repeat over and over songs that we like, and we tend to replay the music that we like, because that's, our music behavior. So if we summarize our music behavior, it comes up to systematic pairing with activities and behaviors, replay of that music over and over again and repeat, and that is happening with something that is meaningful, and it has the potential of causing emotions. Does that ring a bell with Pavlov? So, excuse the pun. So if we go to Pavlov's experiments, what he did was systematically pair food with bell, and then it would result into dogs salivating. In our case, well, the food would be the music, and the bell would be the ways that we listen to music, and that leaves us, well, with earworms being the saliva and us being the dogs. Well, I know it's not the best analogy, but it makes sense if you think about it. And for my research, for my PhD was to try and see if this makes sense. So I thought that, okay, if this is a trained relationship, I can replicate it in the lab. So I designed 2 experiments to explore this. The first experiment was very similar to Pavlov's study. So what I did, I invited participants over to the lab, and then I would have them to repeatedly perform 3 different activities with 3 different sonic environments, as I called them. The 3 different activities were pairing socks, doing an easy kids puzzle, or rolling yarn into a bowl. And the 3 different sonic environments would be a scientific podcast that didn't have any music triggers. It was about a telescope in Chile. And silence to have a control. And I would also play them a music as the 3rd condition, which was a really annoying Scottish song going which of course I ended up having as an earworm after all the sessions. But it's my fault for this one. So I would have them perform the same combination over a period of 3 days, and after the 3 days were over, I'd ask them to complete a short questionnaire, asking them if they had music in their head and what music would that be. So my results were that indeed the music-related session did have more reported earworms of that Scottish song, whereas the other conditions that were paired with the podcast or the silence did not have as many. So yay. So my second study, I decided to explore the already made associations that people have already made for themselves. So the literature shows us that many people listen to music when they're stressed to relax as a coping mechanism. So I decided to explore that. So I decided to go for a study that would induce stress. I know. So I wanted to be really intimidating. And I decided to go for a job interview for an administrative position in the university. And as I'm not the most intimidating person ever, I opted up to have the biggest, bulkiest camera, and I would put it right next to me. So the participants would have to stand up in front of the camera and actually do the interview. But that's not all there is. So I asked for volunteers who use music to regulate their stress, to people who listen to music when they're stressed, as I called them, the stress listeners, and for people who don't, as a control to see what happens between those 2 groups. So the interview process was that they would prepare for 5 minutes for the interview, and then they would stand up in front of a red big cross I had on the floor, and they would have to speak freely for 5 minutes, explaining why they would be the perfect candidate for this position. And that's not all there is. I very sadistically I put them to do a numerical test. So they would have, for the next 5 minutes, they'd have to subtract 13 out of 1,022 going down, I'm not over, with a metronome, like this pace, and if they made a mistake, they would have to start over. I know, it's quite bad. So the thing would be something like 1,022, 1,009, 996, 900, wrong, start over. So that would be for 5 minutes. After this horrible process was over, I asked them to sit down for 5 minutes and relax and forget this thing happened. And then after that, I'd make them complete a questionnaire asking if they had music in their head and how stressed they were. My feeling was that the people who listened to music when they were stressed would have music in their head when they would be stressed from the experiment as a coping mechanism. Because that's the association that they for themselves have made for music. Now, sure enough, my experiment did work. And my stressed listeners indeed had music in their head when they were stressed, whereas the non-stressed listeners did not really have as much music in their head. So these are my results, and these are promising to the hypothesis. But coming back to the other day, why did I have that David Bowie song in my head? The short answer is, I don't know. The long answer is that it could be many reasons. It could be because I was cooking, and when I'm cooking, I usually put music on. The other reason could be that at the same time I was cooking, I was thinking about my research, and I was thinking about a participant who always reported David Bowie songs. And then when I would read their David Bowie earworms, I would have my David Bowie earworms, because that's what I had associated with. Or maybe I was just bored. Maybe I just wanted to listen to music, and it was a bit boring what I was doing, and who cares for cooking? But there seems to be an association of music in our heads and the ways that we listen to music. And my findings do suggest that as well. So next time you have a music in your head, try and see what you have done to condition yourselves to do that. Thank you very much.